The Arken EP8 is a first focal plane 1:8 LPVO, obviously. The reticle on this, the KLbox BDC, is reminiscent of what we see with EOTech products.
Pew pew! Pew!
Its one glaring flaw is that when you have the illumination too bright though, you see a lot of ghosting.
Pew pew! Pew!
However, a quick adjustment of the illumination knob quickly rectifies that issue.
Pew pew! Pew!
As far as how the reticle is designed, I feel it is really intended to be used with illumination for most cases. With the illumination off, you can see that that center dot disappears. You're left with a big ring. For many people, that's going to be an instant turnoff, such as myself. I like being able to rely on a reticle even if something was to fail, such as the illumination, to be able to use it effectively in any sort of condition.
Pew!
For at least some of you, that won't be an issue whatsoever.
Pew!
However, if you don't really know what direction you're going to be going in for an optic, or more specifically what style of reticle it's going to be having, it's going to be something that you should understand. A reticle like this heavily revolves around illumination, especially in lower light environments like this. But even outside in most real-world environments, especially wooded areas, you're going to really heavily rely on that illumination to be able to use the reticle effectively.
Pew pew! Pew!
Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just par for the course.
Pew pew! Pew!
With all that being said, let's do a real quick physical overview before we put this thing in more intense environments. For anyone wondering what the scope costs before we continue on with this review, they're usually $420 before tax, but as of right now, March 25th, 2025, they currently have a sale discount code lowest, and it brings $100 off of that. So with tax for me right now, if I was to buy this, it's around $350, which is not a lot of money. All the information on the outside of the box is pretty standard for Arken and what they offer, and the inside is as stripped and bare bones as possible. But there is a cleaning cloth, a bikini cover, and this really nice colorized owner's manual, which gives you all the information that you're ever going to need about this optic. The optic overall looks and feels really good in hand, especially for the price. Mounted in a zero gravity mount, this is how my friend sent it over to me, and that's how I was going to leave it because I didn't want to have to worry about messing anything up. And honestly, this is a really nice little combination. And with a combined weight of just over 27 ounces, it's not that heavy either. The fast focus eyepiece on this is more than acceptable. It feels okay, it doesn't really feel super tight or super well polished, but again, for the price point, it's more than acceptable. The magnification ring is also fairly standard and straightforward. 1 to 8 is 180 degrees, which is normal across the board, and it feels and sounds pretty good. There is a little hole on top of that thumb ramp for a small cattail, which I did not have at time of filming, and it's honestly more than sufficient for your uses on this optic to adjust it fast. I'm happy that there's a big thumb ramp, and the fact that there's a little thread-on cattail that's included is also really nice. The illumination control is also very standard. We have a couple of night vision modes, which I regretfully did not test, and only one off position. The rest are all on. So if you want to get to one particular setting, you're going to have to rotate it all the way back to 0 to shut it off. However, it sounds and feels honestly very good. The one thing I would like to see changed a little bit in the future is going to be the battery compartment cover. It's the exact same outside diameter of the actual knob itself, and I've had experience in the past when sometimes they can loosen up. As far as our battery compartment, it's a very standard 3-dimple PCB board and our 6-finger leaf spring on top. I haven't had any issues with those personally. One physical attribute that the scope really excels in, though, are the turrets. They both sound and feel really good, and honestly, seem like they're way better than the price point that they currently sit at. A lot of the other scopes that I had and compared against this in my Mega LPVO comparison didn't have as nice as turrets as this. So good job on you, Arken. And that's it, really. There's not a whole lot to talk about with this optic. The fit and finish of everything, the anodizing is pretty good. Again, very accurate and true to what I would expect to see from a $450-ish optic by the time you include taxes and whatnot. And the fact that this is still a first focal plane 1 to 8, you know what? The price point on this thing, just like most other Arken products, is very impressive that they hit. So let's get behind this thing and see what it's actually like to use. If you were to ask me, I would say Arken went full force on trying to mimic EOTech and the Voodoo style reticles that they use in their LPVOs. And it's not a bad thing, it's just something that's going to have some inherent issues that I've already started talking about. Most notably, that center dot and semicircle around it is extremely small. As a result of that, it's going to be very challenging to use this thing in most environments without the aid of illumination. At this thing's maximum magnification, you can see that the Eyebox BDC reticle is quite unique in its overall design. Speaking of, let me show you what Arken put out there to help you understand how to properly use the Eyebox BDC. This will explain it better than I ever could, because I'm a visual learner, and so are a lot of other people, so here you have it. There's a lot going on, and a lot that you would have to understand. However, if you can process this and you use it diligently enough and you memorize this, it is quite effective overall. This, however, will not be everyone's cup of tea, so it's another thing to keep in mind if this is going to be right for you or not. It's definitely much more focused towards precision shooting at the higher magnifications, but on the lower magnifications, as long as again you use the illumination, it also works very well. The illumination on this is also quite bright at its maximum, and even here in a very bright environment with a white piece of paper behind it, it actually gets a little bit too bright, which is awesome. And the ghosting that we saw earlier with the illumination being too bright would completely go away if it was brighter out in the environment around it. Illumination does have some pretty good steps in between it, and again, I regretfully inform you that I did not test this thing under night vision. Seriously though, it's a really good setup illumination. I like the brightness of it, and I like how sharp it is. It doesn't really bloom out or blossom out, and as long as you don't run it in too high of a brightness setting, in a darker environment, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. These turrets really are fantastic. They sound and feel exceptional, and there's only the minorest amount of play when you're inside the detent. Overall, these are superb. As far as tracking, well, we really can't see how well the reticle lines up to my target, only because it's a BDC. It's not in mils or MOA specifically. But we can see what kind of slop we have, if any, with the windage and the elevation turrets, and we can also see how well the elevation tracks across 9 mils. And you know what? It tracks really, really well. And there's no slop that I was able to find in either turret. So, again, very good performance so far, Arken. From the dark, deep depths of my interior garage, we're now outside in my backyard on a very bright sunny day to hopefully have you understand how bad the reticle will work in an environment like this without illumination. You just have a floating ring, and it's a big ring. It's not even like you could really quickly put something right in the center and make a confident shot that you're going to hit exactly where you aim. With the illumination on full, it does provide enough illumination here to be able to use it quite effectively, but not completely effectively. I know for a lot of people, this will not be an issue. It's not even a real issue for me, but for a lot of other people out there that want a little bit more confidence out of where their reticle is and how it's set up and its overall usability, this is going to be lacking. But I'm done talking about the reticle. The image on this thing at 1x is quite flat. There's also very little distortion that we see when we look through the scope and what we see on the outside of the scope. There's an ever so slight pull going up, but it's not as jarring as I've seen on a lot of even second focal plane 1:6 LPVOs. So all in all, quite good optically at 1x. Focusing on our 81-yard tracking target here, I'm slowly ramping up the magnification to really look for any sort of imperfections, and it does get a little bit soft on the outside edge towards the middle magnification, but then it really quickly redeems itself as we get up to 8x. The image here, though, does seem a little bit softer than it did at 1x, and this is a phenomenon that I experienced with this optic, especially on camera. To the naked eye, it wasn't as noticeable, but it still existed, and that is the rear eyepiece. I had trouble finding the perfect setting for where the reticle would be sharp at minimum to maximum magnification and everything in the world that we're focusing on, whether it be close or far, from minimum to maximum magnification, would all be sharp and clear. I do tweak this a little bit, and you'll see that it can get better. But it also then sacrifices on the opposite side of the magnification range. It's one of the few scopes I've ever had experiences like this. I think if you're sensitive to that sort of thing and you're really looking for something that's going to perform flawlessly, it might not be ideal for you. One thing that Arken went to great lengths to try to explain and express with this optic is that it uses Japanese glass. And that's all fine and dandy, but we don't know if it's good quality Japanese glass or poor quality Japanese glass. Just because something is Japanese doesn't necessarily make it good or bad. Illumination there on full is way too bright for this environment, and we have that mirroring effect that we saw earlier. Its low light performance out here seems to have no issues dealing with the lower light at 1x, both to the camera and to the naked eye. Again, at 1x, the image on this thing looks really good. Everything that we're looking at is sharp, clear, and in focus. However, as we slowly increase the magnification, again back to our little paper tracking target at 81 yards, you'll see it gets quite soft. And from there, we're going to put it to extreme extended distances to see if we can notice that in a more well-lit environment. Under the power towers on a bright, beautiful sunny day. Man, I miss the summer. But before I know it, I'll be saying, man, I miss the winter. Illumination out here on full on a very bright sunny day is just acceptable. It's not anywhere near as good as the top contenders in the first focal plane 1 to 8 segment, nor most really nice second focal plane LPVOs, but it's still pretty damn good. As far as the distortion, as we already talked about, it is very low on 1x, and its overall performance is quite spectacular. I was not expecting this thing to outperform a lot of significantly more expensive LPVOs when I did my overall mega premium LPVO comparison. But you know what? That's exactly what this thing did at 1x. It was quite good. The view through this thing is also on the larger side, and the overall scope profile isn't as big as I was expecting it to be, given again its overall price point and its overall footprint. It's not a very large nor heavy optic, so it's really a pretty compelling package, especially for the price. With that all being said, let's now focus on our first solar panel at 360-ish yards. I did mention in a lot of my other videos, I thought it was 500 and then like 750 and then like, what was it, 1,000? I was completely wrong. It's 360, 666, which I'm not joking, that's what I got, and 1,000. As I slowly bring up the magnification to our first 360-yard solar panel, you'll see that the image doesn't really lose much focus once we get there, as opposed to what we saw earlier under the thick canopy of my backyard. At 360 yards, at maximum magnification, the image looks pretty good. A little bit cloudy, a little bit soft, but there could have been a little bit extra haze in the air given that this was the tail end of the summer. Overall, I do feel that the image is more than usable enough, considering this is 360 yards, to engage this target with the proper zeros set up for the BDC, we'd still be really close towards the center. However, let me show you just how sensitive the rear ocular adjustment is on this thing. This is set up where the reticle is as perfectly sharp as I can get it, and at 100 yards on the lower paper at 6 o'clock, and the 180-ish yards on the berm that we're focused on the center, none of it really looks all that spectacular. But a very minor twist of the rear ocular housing brings a lot of things into quite good focus, but the reticle does lose a little bit of overall sharpness. I ended up spending a lot of time fiddling with this in varying locations, and ultimately I was able to come to the conclusion that something was going to have to be sacrificed, and ultimately I chose to have the reticle be slightly off, but the image be as good as possible. This is something that I don't know if a lot of people are going to really notice. On camera, like I said, it's much more blaringly obvious, but to the naked eye, our eyes can really focus in between that a lot better. Ultimately, though, it is something to take note of and to mention. As you can see, I back it out to 1x, and the focus was still a little off. So, things to take note of. As far as being back out here, looking out to the 666 yard and the 1,000 yard solar panels, it's still a pretty good looking image. It's not razor sharp, but again, given this thing's price point, I have to say it's more than acceptable. There's one last thing we really have to check, and that's going to be overall image stability. I cannot find my Eyebox portion of this review when I filmed it 6 or so months ago, so I don't have that. I apologize. But its overall Eyebox was pretty decent. It was acceptable. At 8x, shifting side to side, you could see that the shadows creep up quite quickly, but they are progressive, meaning that it's not as annoying to be at 8x behind this thing and, be in a slightly off position. Ultimately, the reticle and the picture stay pretty sharp to one another. The same thing can be said for 6x, but it doesn't appear that much larger when we get behind it. It's about the same performance as we saw at 8x. So going from 6 to 8, you're really not getting that much of an overall benefit. Continuing to bring it down, we go in increments of 2. So here at 4x, you can see the full reticle. Again, it seems like we hit those shadows very quickly. And we also start to notice that the image starts to fall apart once we get towards those shadows, which is not a great combination. Now, it usually is on first focal plane 1 to 8s and 1 to 10s. The in-between magnification here at around 4-ish x to about 1.5x, the image stability falls off really, really quickly. This thing still manages to be quite usable at these in-between magnifications, where a lot of other much more expensive optics really fall short here. It's honestly one of the better performances of the bunch when it comes to overall image stability, and it's something that really impressed me. However, the Eyebox is definitely at best average. I would like to see it improved a little bit more, but that would probably require this thing getting a full redesign. Overall, again, for the price point and its overall performance, I'm quite pleased. On to our first of 3 comparisons. On the left will be the EP8, and we are going to first put it up against the Nightforce NX8 featuring the DMX reticle. Now, the first thing that you must note is that the Nightforce is around $1,800 or so, whereas the EP8 again falls in line with that roughly, $400-ish price point. So a pretty significant difference between the two. Reticles are also quite different, yet quite similar. I think at 1x, or rather the lower magnifications, they're both a little bit weak, but at the top end, you got to give it to the DMX. It is absolutely wonderful. The Nightforce also has much brighter illumination, and it's just got a better overall qualitative feel. They are made in Japan versus China with the EP8s, but again, you have to factor in a roughly $1,400 price delta. Another thing that has to be factored in is size and weight. The NX8 is about 1.5 inches shorter than the EP8, and it's also about 4 ounces lighter. It is a very small and lightweight scope. However, the EP8 does beat it out when it comes to overall field of view, 21.5 feet at 1x to about 106 feet, and then on the top end, 14.5 to 13.2. Both have the exact same eye relief at 3.7 inches. Optically, we have to give it to the NX8. However, its image stability did feel a little bit tricky at times, if I may be so bold. I also noticed that the illumination on the NX8, though very, very bright, does also have some weird artifacts when you're behind it a very particular way, quite similar with the EP8, but in a slightly different variation. Ultimately, though, these both might be first focal plane 1 to 8s, but the way that they get there are quite different. Again, does your budget allow for an NX8? If it does, it opens up the door for a lot of other optics. If you're looking for one that's going to give you a better value, though, probably the EP8, if I may be so bold. You see a lot of scope body with the NX8. The EP8 is a much better experience to get behind from a shooting standpoint. The view through it's larger, the scope profile is a little bit smaller, and the eye relief is pretty decent. The NX8 does have a fairly forgiving eye box at the lower magnification, but up top, I also really didn't feel overwhelmed by it. With the EP8 dialed in with its focus, both of these produce quite good images. I still have to give it to the NX8 by a pretty decent margin, but if you were to do a real quick blind test with these two, it would probably require a little bit of concentration to see which one you preferred. There actually is more chromatic aberration with the NX8 as opposed to the EP8. With the EP8, I barely noticed any, but the sharpness and the colors and the clarity definitely have to go to the NX8. Again, I would kind of hope so for the price point. Even when we push these out to 300 yards on these paper targets under the thick, heavy canopy, both of them look pretty good. The lighting was slightly different because obviously the sun moves in the sky as the Earth rotates around it, and shadows are going to be different, and overall ambient lighting conditions are going to change. But here, there's nothing really I would give to one or the other. They're both quite good. Ultimately, budget is going to be the one big factor. And if you can afford the NX8, it's going to open you up to a much greater field of optics. However, if you can't, just know that the EP8, at least from this perspective, holds its own against something like the NX8 for a much smaller amount of money. Similar to the NX8 is the Primary Arms PLxC in first focal plane. This optic is also about $1,500-ish, so about $1,000 plus over the EP8. It's also about 4 ounces lighter, and it's about an inch or so shorter. Its field of view, though, however, matches that of the EP8, despite the fact it is smaller and lighter and only has a 30mm tube as opposed to a 34mm tube like the EP8. The view through the PLxC is just about as good as you can get from a first focal plane 1:8. Despite the fact that I still feel that the C stands for compromised, it is very impressive to get behind at 1:6x. At 8x, you can see the image does soften up, especially on the outside edge, and there's almost nothing you can do about it. Illumination absolutely goes to the EP8. The PLxC in first focal plane, anyway, was always one that I complained about from the beginning. Its illumination is poor at best, but the reticle design of all of the reticles for the PLxC lineup are in such a way designed that they don't necessarily require illumination to be useful in any sort of environment. But if you do like using your illumination as a crutch, as a guide, as your main focal point, then this PLxC is not going to be for you. Yes, they do offer a second focal plane PLxC, but it doesn't offer anything other than just much brighter illumination over the first focal plane version. In fact, I actually prefer the first focal plane version to the second focal plane version optically, and that's never actually happened before. At 6x with the PLxC, the image really does sharpen up, and the lower you go, the better it gets. The PLxC, though, is troubled by image stability at the in-between magnifications. With EP8, as you saw, it's really not that bad. If you want to see how bad the PLxC does, go check out my Mega LPVO comparison, and you'll see that it falls completely flat on its face from like 1.5 to 4x, which for me is a big deal. Now, I still do like the PLxC, but I would like to see a Gen 2 come out soon. Primary Arms is introducing a new version very soon that's going to have much brighter illumination than what this offers. I don't know if it's going to be as bright as what we see with the NX8 or the Attacker or the Gen 3 Razor, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's at least 80% of what those scopes are capable of illumination-wise. And if it is, and they tweak the image just a little bit, then it would really be a force to be reckoned with. But as is right now between these two, optically, I gotta give it to the EP8 as an overall variable optic. In specific magnifications, it's the PLxC from 1 to 6. It really is spectacular. But image stability-wise, it goes to the EP8. So it really is a give and take. But if you're looking for a small, lightweight package, you'd really be talking about the PLxC versus the NX8. And again, I go into that at great depths with my Mega LPVO comparison, so go check that out. But between these two, it ultimately comes down to, again, your budget and what you're looking for. Honestly, if you're looking for an optic that's just going to give you a good overall experience, it's going to be the EP8. The PLxC is really fine-tuned for only some of the magnification and only give you the 8x for the center. The center right around that segmented circle is wonderful, but everything else, as you can very clearly see, really, really does fall short. Our last comparison is going to be with the Vector Continental in second focal plane. That is right. This is a $550-ish LPVO, but if you use code CDOES, at any website from Vector. That's 10% off of your order. So that really does bridge the gap a little bit. It's also a couple of ounces lighter. It's about 2.5 ounces lighter. It's a little bit longer though, by about an inch, but the field of view is larger, 123 to 121 and 15.3 to 14.5. The Conti also has 3.8 inches of eye relief as opposed to 3.7. Now, the Continental second focal plane, 1 to 8, with its wonderful fiber dot illuminated reticle, is one of the best 1 to 8 LPVOs I've ever gotten behind. It's so good, in fact, that I think it's even better than the 1 to 6 that I requested from Vector, which I thought would be better than the 1 to 8, and it's just not. It just seems like the Eyebox is still as tight as it is with the 1 to 8, but with the 1 to 8, you're getting that image. You're getting that view through it. You're getting a pretty small scope profile, smaller than what we see with the EP8, and a much larger view looking through it. Also, because it is in the second focal plane, we don't have any of the mirroring issues of the illumination being too bright and darker in environments. And the reticle is really stupid simple to use. A 36/50 yard zero would give you all the flexibility in the world to take you out to 400 or 500 yards. And on a 5.56 gas carbine, do you really need much more than that at all? And if you do, I would actually recommend not using an LPVO. I'd step it up to an MPVO or something like that. This is the biggest point of contention with all of these first focal plane LPVOs. Optically, they all fall a little short to even a decent second focal plane LPVO. This Continental is definitely on the lower end of the price spectrum, $550. You could probably find them on sale, plus with my discount code, you're talking about under $500. That's a lot of scope for not a lot of money. They have a much better overall qualitative feel than the Arkens, and they just work. They've worked really, really well. I've been very impressed with them. And the proof is in the pudding. Optically here, it's the Continental hands down. Sharpness, clarity, and overall brightness is much better with the Continental. Reticle and illumination are as well. And it begs the question, do you really need a first focal plane 1 to 8? And if you do, if you say, yes, I do, what are the reasons? Give yourself 2 valid reasons why you need a first focal plane 1 to 8 as opposed to being able to get away with a second focal plane LPVO. That is my homework for all of you. Because if you can't come up with 2 solid reasons why you want a first focal plane LPVO, then I don't think you should really get one. I would instead highly recommend a second focal plane 1 to 6 or 1 to 8 like this. That's going to be about the same price point, if not even sometimes less. That's going to give you more flexibility with the optic and just give you an overall much better experience with using it. It's not going to have the image stability issues as most first focal planes. It's going to have much better and more practical illumination, and most times the reticles are going to be much easier to use at varying magnifications and distances. I really don't know what else I can say about this optic, whether we're talking specifically about that or if we're on the subject of should you first focal plane or second focal plane your LPVO. If you really do think that a first focal plane LPVO would be a better purchase point for you, the 1 to 8 magnification range is the minimum that I would recommend going for, because in a 1 to 6, it's almost a little bit limiting because a first focal plane is not as good as a second focal plane, and there are a lot of really good second focal plane 1 to 6s out there. But if you wanted to go with a 1 to 6 in first focal plane, the size 6 is as good as you can possibly get. As far as a 1 to 8, though, it's a mixed bag. The field is very, very scattered. This EP8, I feel, actually slots itself in at a very good point. Not just price-wise, but performance-wise. A lot of people have raved about this scope for a long time, and I wanted to get my hands on one sooner, but such is life. I'm just glad that I got my hands on one at all. And after playing around with it for a few months, actually, I have to say, I didn't hate it. I wasn't completely blown away. But when you factor in the price point that this thing comes in and how well it performs in most in-between things, like in-between magnifications, as opposed to other first focal plane 1 to 8s and 1 to 10s, it really is quite impressive. I feel that this optic is perfect for the person that wants to experience a decent first focal plane LPVO that isn't going to break the bank, just to see if it's going to work out for them. It's a trial optic. You get into this and you say, this works for me, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you sell it, or you put it on a loaner gun and you move on to something else. If it does work for you, you run it as hard as you can until you feel like you're ready to expand beyond that, and then you dump a lot of money into like an Attacker or a Gen 3 Razor HD. Granted, those aren't 100% perfect optics either, but as far as its overall package, they're really nice scopes. But keep in mind, they're going to be $2,500, which is a lot of money. Ultimately, I think this optic will make a lot of people happy because it already has. But if you are on the fence about going first focal plane or second focal plane, I would strongly urge you to look at a really good second focal plane, 1-6 or 1-8. Anything beyond that, I would honestly recommend going into a 2.5-10, a 2-10, a 2-12, something like that, and then run an offset red dot if you really need the 1x. Because at that point, if you don't really need the 1x, but you want the 1x, an offset red dot and an IPVO would really be a much more versatile and capable package on any platform of firearm. So you really have to come to terms with what you're looking for, what you're thinking about, and ultimately what you're willing to get out of your overall setup. However, one last time, if you're thinking about getting into a first focal plane LPVO, this is a pretty good entry point for you to test it out without breaking the bank. And guess what? If you like it, you'll probably be able to get a lot of good use out of this thing for a long time. With all that being said, a huge thank you to my friend for strong-arming me into reviewing this with my other first focal plane LPVOs, because it really was eye-opening to see that there is a great divide between all of those optics regardless of price point. And I gotta say, it was pretty cool to see. Anyway, again, a huge thank you to him, and a huge thank you for all of you for staying tuned as long as you have. I really do appreciate you. As always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe Star subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.